The only thing greater than sport is the spirit that rises from it. That spirit unites cultures, races, backgrounds. In a dark world, sport grows its power. Power to destroy prejudice. So that when the world outside tells us to fall, instead, we rise.
Hi, good morning and welcome. I want to welcome everybody to today's conversation, Equality versus Equity, a RISE Digital Learning Series webinar. We're really excited at RISE to have this conversation today in conjunction with EverFi, helping us put it on. I know that we have some students from New York. We also have some students from Michigan who are going to be here listening in to the panel discussion, which is the main event for today's discussion. So we want to welcome them. Welcome also to all the administrators and others who are listening into the conversation. Really excited to have this discussion today. My name is Dr. Andrew Mac Intosh. I'm the VP of Curriculum here at RISE. We're going to have a small discussion today about some of the things that we do educationally, and then we're going to get into our panel discussion. Let's go in. I want to first recognize the panelists who will be speaking today. We have Tiki Barber, who will be our moderator. He is, a part of the Tiki and Tierney national syndicated show. We have Nate Solder, who's a current player with the New York Giants. And we also have Diahann's Billings-Burford, who is the CEO here at RISE. So the panelists will get going a little bit later. We want to start, however, by talking a little bit about who we are at RISE and what we do. One of the things we believe at RISE is that the only thing greater than sport is the spirit that arises from it. Sport for us is a really great platform and a really great context for us to have discussions about race and race relations. Sport is a place and a space that brings people together. It unifies them. It allows them to work past and look past the differences that they have, whether these differences are race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. So we really excited to have this conversation today and dig in a little bit deeper around the topic of equality versus equity, and to hear from some greats in the game who've played the game of football and get their perspective on this conversation. So excited for the conversation. I want to begin by introducing Tiki Barber, like I said, who will be our moderator for the panel discussion portion of today's programming. Tiki, as I said, is current host of the Tiki and Tierney show, which is part of CBS Sport Radio. He was a former running back with the New York Giants for 10 seasons. He played with the University of Virginia, so he's alum of the University of Virginia. And he's involved in several nonprofits, several charities, a lot of work in the community and community engagement. So excited to have you here as a part of this discussion today, Tiki.
Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. I'm excited to be here, especially to talk to Diahann, who I met a few months ago down at the Super Bowl, and obviously Nate, who plays with my New York Giants now. I guess they're your New York Giants as well. But this is such an important conversation to have, particularly with what's going on in our country. And COVID-19 is one thing, but being forced inside and seeing what's happening with race relations around our country is a completely different one. I know we're all emotionally heightened. Some of it is anger and it's justified, but ultimately having a better understanding about each other is the only way that we make this place and our country a better place for our kids. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Dr. McIntosh, for having me.
Thanks a lot, Tiki. I think a really good place to start, especially based on some of those points you just raised, is by showing a little bit of a graphic that we use to educate in our conversation with RISE. RISE, as I mentioned earlier, one of our core principles is education around these issues. And one of the conversations that has certainly come up with current events, but one of the things that we've been trying to have conversations about over the past 5 years as we've worked with teams and coaches, et cetera, is how do we get to fairness? Is equality the best way to do that? Is equity the best way to do that? And potentially, what are some of the similarities and differences between equality and equity? So this graphic, we think, does a really good job of highlighting what some of those differences might be. On the back end, I'll share some poll numbers with folks. But before we get to the polls and hear what persons have said, I just want to ask any of the students who are in the audience, what are some notable differences you see between the graphic on the left, which describes equality, and the graphic on the right that describes equity? Any of the students can unmute and share a perspective with us.
What I see is on the left side is they all have the same block on below them, but the smallest one, which would be the littlest, or would be the little kid, he can't see over the fence, but the man in the blue shirt can see without even standing up, or you could say he could just see it, and he can see with the block. And then the girl in the middle, she has nothing changed about her. She just needs one block. But the little boy, he needs 2 blocks to see the baseball game.
Excellent, excellent. Anybody else have anything to add real quick? I think you did a good job, Diahann. Okay, yeah, that was good. I think you were spot on. So inequality, even though all of them have 1 box each, the resources that they're given, the box that they're given doesn't quite help everybody in the same way. The tallest person in that graphic can already see over the fence, so he doesn't really need a box to do that. The shortest person, as you alluded to, Diahann, he still can't see over the fence with just 1 block. And so, I think what this graphic really brings out for us is whether equality is enough. In all situations, if we are to think about fairness, the resources and the access to resources that people need to have, do we need to give everybody the same thing? Or might there be different ways of providing resources to persons, as the graphic on the right alludes to? So I think this is really good. I hope some of this comes out in our discussion, Tiki, as we move on. I know you and I shared a little bit of a quote yesterday that, equality might be a coach giving his players shoes or cleats, but equity would be giving players shoes or cleats that fit. So any thoughts about that quote and how it kind of captures this dynamic?
That's exactly right. But I'm going to stick specifically to this image that we're looking at right now. And I don't think it's accidental that the man in blue is Caucasian. I'm assuming that the woman in the middle is Asian, and the little boy is African American. But my takeaway from this is equality is fantastic and it's necessary for an equal society. But when you look at equity, equity often takes a sacrifice from someone else. And in this case, the white individual sacrificed his block so that the little boy could stand on the same level as him and see the baseball game. So I think the takeaway for me simply from this image is that equity takes sacrifice. And sometimes we don't comprehend that or understand it enough to have the right conversation around equality in this country.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. We've had conversations around privilege and the power that privilege gives us and the ability it gives us to help others. So I think you are absolutely right in terms of someone giving up what they may not need as much as someone else in order to have fairness and in order to advance progress in the society. So I think we're able to move on. One of the things we wanted to do was reach out to folks. So we sent some questions out to some stakeholders to get their take on, did they see a difference between equality and equity? And what we saw is that overwhelmingly, people said yes. As we've pointed out some of those distinctions and some of those differences, they also saw differences between equality and equity. And I think it's important for us to understand where we need equality. So, equal treatment before the law. We would want equality in those instances, but there are certainly a number of other instances, education, criminal justice, etc., where equity might be a better approach. The second question we polled persons on is whether or not athletes should use their platform to advocate for equality and equity. Should they be standing up for these types of causes? I know that over the last week, we've heard a number of athletes in different sports speak out and stand up. And again, overwhelmingly, 91% of persons said, yes, athletes should use this platform. We are certainly happy to see that at RISE, and we are here to help educate, to help empower, to help amplify athletes in the work that they are already doing final question that we asked was, should more be done? Is there more that can be done to move the needle, so to speak, as it relates to racial equality or racial equity? And again, overwhelmingly, persons said yes. So, we heartened to see that, as we think about doing this work and as we partner with others like yourself, Tiki, Nate, and others around this conversation, that, the vast majority of stakeholders that we have feel as strongly about this. We're excited to move into the panel portion of today's discussion. I know that Nate and Diahann and yourself, Tiki, will have a really good conversation today. So I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our panelists, and excited for today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. I'm really looking forward to this as well. I'll start by introducing Nate Solder, who is an offensive tackle for the New York Giants. He played at the University of Colorado and was drafted back in 2011. You can read this if you're watching on the slides. Obviously, two-time champion with the New England Patriots, and we hope that he helps bring a championship to our New York Giants. Obviously, one of the great men in the National Football League. He has been the Walter Payton Man of the Year nominee, both for the Patriots and for the New York Giants last year. And his organization, Compassionate International, which is a faith-based organization and interacts with kids and organizations around the world, is one of the most amazing things that you've heard and you will hear. So, Nate, welcome to this panel discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What are you most excited about to talk about here?
Actually just jumped right out at me right away. I don't believe that there's any accidents, and God predestined all this. He's in control of all these things. Even the image you put before us right there, I think it's real interesting. The tallest man, I'm a tall man, I'm Caucasian man, and I have a blue shirt on. I don't think that's a mistake, So I'm glad that we can have this conversation together, because I think you hit it on the head. I think that it takes sacrifice, and I think that it's also realizing that the position that you're put in. I don't think it's anyone's fault, both the guy without the box and both the guy with the box. It's not their fault, but I think they have a responsibility to each other to share what they have, because I don't think everything we have is for ourselves. So I'd love to talk more about that and get into that further.
Yeah, we definitely will. Next is Diahann Billings-Burford, who is the CEO of RISE. She's worked in many different positions, including in the New York City government and at Time Warner. She has her psychology degree from Yale University and also a law degree from Columbia. So you are very educationally accomplished, but also professionally accomplished, and you've been in service for a long time. So as CEO of RISE, you have a fantastic platform and ability to lead that platform and make a change through education. Diahann, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And I just want you both to know it's really my New York Giants. I'm a fan. The team belongs to us. I was on an interview last week with Troy. And I told him I didn't even like Troy Vincent until I came to RISE. He's on the board. He's an excellent board member. But for me, he was just an eagle that I just never really wanted to see back in the day. So,
yeah, I agree.
My New York Giants.
I had my headaches with Troy myself, and all those.
I bet you did.
they were all my nemesis. Diahann, I'll start asking this question of you. Now, we saw the lessons in the slides that were just presented, but there have been a lot of racial profiling issues that have, I think, taken up our collective consciousness. Obviously, Ahmaud Arbery down in Georgia, George Floyd, the protests, the demonstrations that we've seen. Let me ask you, as a country, where are we now when it comes to equity and equality, and what changes do you see needing to happen?
I think I love this question, and I love this panel, because I really wanted to make sure what we do today is of value and is really honest. The RISE, we don't believe that you need to have easy conversations. We believe in having the difficult conversations in a way that moves us forward. And so I think the answer to that question, in short, is that in many ways, America has focused on equality. But the difference between equality and equity means that, to your point, I love that you guys already touched on sacrifice, but what it also means is people are not having an equal experience because you have equality. And in many ways, we have equality. We are blessed to live in a country that we do have the laws, and technically we all live by the same laws, but we don't have a fair system because we're not having the same experience under those laws. And so I think a lot of the unrest that we're seeing, I think the horrible murders that we're seeing, what we're seeing play out is that we have failed to strive for equity. And now is the time where I think that's what we have to strive for. So everybody has the same experiences, or at least has the same opportunity to have the same type of life experiences.
So Diahann, I ask you, the lessons that sports provides, it's why athletes should be the examples and they should use their voices. Is it too much sometimes to ask athletes to be that? There was some criticism doled out yesterday by a very prominent writer about Black quarterbacks not saying anything and not having a statement on this. Is it too much pressure on some of these athletes?
Absolutely. So here's what I think. RISE exists because we actually don't think that every athlete needs to speak and act in this space. We believe that, athletes, professional, collegiate, are people, and people have got to do what's authentic to them. So I think to have the expectation that every single athlete should be a voice on every single issue, it's not fair. It doesn't make sense. And more, it doesn't necessarily move us forward, right? Like one of the things we teach at RISE is the beauty of most team sports is that different people have different roles. And you don't expect people to play somebody else's role. It doesn't work when you do that. And so we think everybody has a right to their own opinions. We want people to share. We want people to be open and to be honest and to be authentic. We engage all the rookies at all of the clubs that let us in fairly consistently, but that does not mean that every athlete needs to be speaking on every one of these issues. However, I will say that one of the things we are pushing at RISE, we also really push diversity. And so while I don't think that every athlete needs to speak on every issue, I do think we have always got to be aware on issues of racism that we have more than one race speaking. It is not the role only of the oppressed to identify oppression, right? It has to be people that benefit from the system to identify it as well. And so I put that caveat in there because I think it's important. It's what makes us one country and one community.
That brings me back to the conversation about equality versus equity and the observation that I had around sacrifice. And so Nate, it almost is it's not a sacrifice, it's too strong of a word, but it almost is for, it feels like, at least from an African-American standpoint, for a white athlete to lend their voice to these issues because of the potential backlash. Is that truthful? Is that how most see it, or am I off base?
I think that's true. I think anything that a person says in the public is going to have some backlash. So you might as well stand up for what you believe in and what you think is right, and another thing that stuck out in that image that I didn't say was when there was some equity in that, how everyone enjoyed the game so much more. You look across, they're all enjoying it. So it's a sacrifice, but it's also for the greater enjoyment of everybody. So the sacrifice is for the good of both groups. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, you put society on a level playing field, regardless of race or creed or really education or any other metric that you could determine. Now, Diahann, as we look back at this conversation of equity versus equality, have you experienced this in your life?
Sure. You mentioned earlier my degrees, and the truth is, I'm just a girl from Brooklyn, and I was not raised wealthy at all. And I have clearly attained certain things that have brought me more privilege in my life. But the reality is I was able to do it because there were programs in place that brought about equity. I was able to leverage things that gave me opportunities that maybe my race, my gender, my socioeconomic class would not naturally afford me. And so, I believe in equity because I've lived it. And again, I think if we offer individuals, if we want to be a whole society, if we want to be a just society, for me, a lot of it comes from Christian values. So I think if we want to follow the right values, we want to do justice. And if we're going to do that, right, then it requires equity, because everybody does not start at the same place and through no fault of their own. And more, everybody doesn't start at the same place and through no merit of their own. There are those that have just been graced with certain attributes. In the picture, the man is taller because he's older, right? He just happens to have a trait that's different than someone else, but he didn't do anything to earn that. He just is taller, you know? And so we've got to move that way in society to understand some of us don't have certain things and we didn't do anything not to have them. And some of us have things and we really did not do anything to have them.
Yeah. Now, Nate, you've donated $1 million, millions of dollars, I should say, over the years to children throughout the world. And I wonder, because this wasn't your core conversation that you were having as your faith-based international organization was developing. Are you evolving how you're talking to a lot of minorities, I'm assuming, across the world and even in this country?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I grew up in a middle-class home in a town predominantly that was white, Caucasian. So I didn't know a lot of these dynamics, and I'm thankful for sports for introducing it to me. But now I see my role in that, and I see the privilege that I've been given, and I see the responsibility that I have too. And so it's been a great blessing for us to go to these countries to be able to help them. And I'll say this too, they help us and they show us and they share with us so much more than we could possibly give to them with some simple material things.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the beautiful things about that.
You know, let me jump back to your organization and what has been most fulfilling about it, right? It's because it's not easy. It's easy for us to say, oh, he started this great charity and it's raised millions of dollars and it's donated and they've traveled. But it's not easy. I know that. But what's been most fulfilling for you to be a part of that?
Well, there's been so many things. One thing that sticks out right away is we have children of our own, and they, like you said, not any fault of their own, or not any merit of their own, but they live in a wealthy home, you know, and so how can we raise our kids to where they have the solid character and the solid values that they want? So we have to introduce them to new parts of the world, different parts of the world, where they can see these things, they can experience these things, and actually you become friends and you get to have relationships with people that come from different places than you. So that's been a huge blessing for us in raising our kids and trying to do the best by them.
Diahann, you know, athletes have always had a voice with social equality or highly political and charged events around our country. One, obviously, that jumps to everybody's mind is Muhammad Ali in the Vietnam War and sacrificing his career, at least temporarily, because he wouldn't go fight. Jim Brown obviously jumps to mind. You know, as we think about the role of sports, and mostly we talk about athletes, but what's the role of sports organizations as it pertains to this? Because that's where I'll do the contrast, the millionaires versus the billionaires. This is where the billionaires can make a difference.
Yeah, this is a interesting question, right? I mean, we could come at it from to whom more is given, more is required. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are approaching it that way and saying, so if the professional athlete is given $100, then every franchise owner needs to be given $100 million. And I think there is, again, if we're talking about equity versus equality, there's some truth in that. I think, though, if we separate the franchise owners from the organizations, meaning they are employers, right? The NFL, the NBA, the NHL, we've got places where we have the real ability to look at the differences of equality versus equity and put that to action in a workplace in a way that would be seen more than it would be seen in any other workplace, right? Like, to me, that's kind of what happened with Colin. Some of it was about how players were interacting with one another when one person was exercising their right. But the other thing that was happening is the rest of the world was looking at a workplace situation go on. And what does equity and equality look like in the workplace? And so I think there is this huge responsibility. I don't necessarily think it's fair. I think because of the way our country and others, quite honestly, look at professional sport, we forget that this is workplace. We are watching whether there is equity and equality in the workplace when we're really looking at these issues as far as what the organization should do. We're having the same issue, right? NFL is revisiting the Rooney Rule. But again, this is really just about equity in the workplace. It's not to diminish it, but it's just that when we put it in the sports space, we somehow think we're looking at something else, but we're looking at the exact same issues just in the, in front of the world for everyone to see.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we talk about the Rooney Rule, it's almost as if we are saying give an African American or minority coach an advantage, right? If they haven't earned it, they should still get an opportunity to do it. And incentivizing is the wrong way to go about it. So Nate, as you think about your coaches, have you ever looked at a coach based on his race? I'm thinking back to my coaches. I've had an African American running back coach. I've had a white running back coach. I never even thought about it until the Rooney Rule started to become questioned. How do you guys think about that internally?
That's a good question. I can only speak for myself, but I think I feel the same way as you do. I don't think much about that. I think more the qualities of the coach, how they coach, what they coach. But I'm a supporter of a couple things, and one is having people of color in positions of leadership and power, and I'm one of supporting women in positions of. And the reason I am is because I think it's going to make organizations better. I think that diverse perspectives, the quality of leadership that they provide, I think that's my biggest belief for that.
Yeah. No, if your coach was African American, it wouldn't make a difference in the world, especially if he knew what he was doing. Right. At the end of the day, we want someone who can make us better. And if you're making me better, whether you're white, black, female, or Muslim, I'm going to be behind you and support you.
Right.
That's exactly right. Now, Diahann, as today we're talking equality and equity in the program that RISE has founded, and Stephen Ross, who is of related companies and obviously the owner of the Miami Dolphins, started this back in 2015, and it's an amazing initiative of what RISE is trying to do to bridge this gap by using sports as a tool. And sports has always been an example. What are the best ways for sports to promote equality, equity, and champion the issues of social justice?
Well, for us, we think the best way is educate. And then the next thing is empower. And listen, we fully leverage that. We think we're the experts at the educating and how do we have these conversations and how do we discuss these issues. And we acknowledge that for some in our country, when they interact with RISE, this is the first time they're having these discussions. It's not that they're not educated because they pushed it away. It just has never been brought to them. So we think educating, and then we think empowering people, because really it's not that we're the answer, it's we're educating our entire community because the entire community is the answer. And then the last thing I would say, it goes back to a question you asked earlier. I don't think every athlete needs to be speaking in this space. It really needs to be what they feel called to do. However, we would be remiss if we fail to recognize that in our society, athletes have the ability to gain people's attention and potentially educate on issues in ways that others cannot. And so again, back to that belief that to whom much is given, much is required. For many professional athletes, you have been given this ability to have an important impact. And so what do you do with it?
I think you're exactly right. And Diahann, Nate, I thank you so much for joining me on this panel. I think we're going to open it up now to a question and answer session. Am I correct? Yes, I think we are. So Dr. McIntosh, back to you.
Thank you. So I don't know if we have any questions from students, administrators who are listening in. Really good conversation, really good discussion there. If you do have a question, if you can maybe digitally raise your hand, use those 3 dots to the right, and I'll call on you, and we go from there. Are there any questions? I'll start with one. Let me throw one out and give others time to think. I know one of the things that comes up as we show that graphic is the question of hard work. You know, we talked a little bit about people starting at different points and people having advantages over others. But does the question of equity negate the hard work that someone has put in? I know people sometimes get a bit defensive about that. So, you know, members of the panel, just your thoughts about that. You too, Tiki.
Yeah, I'll begin. Like, hard work is what made me. I was given an opportunity because I was good enough at the University of Virginia to get drafted, but it didn't go easy. I mean, the Giants tried to replace me every year for the first 3 years. And eventually I figured it out. And I think in some parts that's luck. In other parts, it's having the right relationship with my head coach at the time, Jim Fossil. But ultimately, when he was fired and Jim and Tom Coughlin came in, if I hadn't worked harder at that point, I wouldn't have had the career that I had. So hard work is imperative. I think it's the given. It's the base of success. Now, obviously, a lot of African Americans in this country feel like they are starting, you know, in the dugout, whereas some Caucasians are starting on second base. Some are 3 feet from home. And so how do you catch up? And the only way to catch up is to have help, obviously, but also work harder than those that have been given advantages. And so when you think about it in that analogy, I think it tells you where we are as a country. Most African Americans feel like they're not even at the plate yet, and others in this country have a huge advantage, especially Caucasians.
I agree with you. I think hard work is a minimum standard. And I think it would be wrong to say, you know, some of us didn't gain some advantages along the ways to get where we are, you know. So I totally agree with that.
The other question I had, Peter, I wondered if we could maybe put the graphic back up. I wanted to just kind of look at the graphic as I asked this question. Is that possible? Thank you. So if we look at this image again, I think one of the things that's interesting and sometimes comes up is here you have groups of individuals being given resources to look over this fence. So I wondered, you know, I'll throw this out for the panelists and also for the students who are in the room, this virtual room, this digital room. Is there any other way that we might solve this situation? Is there a way we can solve it?
I think we can also educate our peers on it because yes, equity is a necessity, but also education. So if we continue to educate our peers about these issues, then more people will be aware about it. And also educating African Americans about their history, about the struggle that continues on. And so with education, more people can be open, more people can realize the system that binds some people in place. And so we can fight that oppression. And of course, with equity, that also benefits us with not only providing more education, but allocating resources towards making things better, towards better education, towards better towards better homes for people of color, fixing neighborhoods, as well as just allowing people of color to have the right tools to enter a job that they want to have field that they want to. But yeah, that's all I had to say.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so I think you're talking a lot about some of the systemic things. And I think it ties in just right with the question I was asking. So one of the things that often comes up is that we could remove this fence. You know, if we were able to remove the fence, then all three individuals would be able to see the game. And so as we think about equality and equity, a good thing to think about is what are the systemic barriers that we are trying to overcome? I don't know if the panelists have any thoughts.
Yeah, you know, Dr. McIntosh, every time I look at this picture, I love it even more. And I think something else pops into my mind. And so I started thinking about sacrifice. So the guy in the blue shirt sacrifices his resource so that the younger, smaller African-American kid can stand. But let's say that the resources are limited, and we know that that's certainly the case. And there's only one box. And if there's only one box, then for them to all be on equal standing and be able to see over the fence, then the one box you give to the woman in the middle, the girl in the middle, and the guy in the blue shirts puts the young kid on his back. You know,
Yep.
I remember growing up, you know, my mom explained this to me once about why you should always do the right thing. And it was because no matter what you do, the steps you take in school and sports, etc., you're getting there because people are helping you. And in a sense, you're standing on their shoulders. And so when you finally hit your pinnacle, hopefully hit your pinnacle, all those people that you see, whose shoulders you've been standing on, are looking up at you and proud of you and clapping at you. And you need to make them proud. And so that jumps to my mind as I think about a limited resource situation, that there could still be equity, but it would take you know, one person going above and beyond to provide a resource that didn't exist.
I love that you said that. I literally had never thought of that, and I've looked at this thing a lot. But you know, I do think it's important to talk about how do we look at equity when resources are scarce, right? Like if we look at our country right now, part of what I think is happening as people are stressed because they feel like the economy isn't doing well and jobs aren't doing well, and that does not usually push people to be more fair and to stretch your analogy, Tiki, to put somebody else on their back, right? But it's probably what is required. It's a great point.
Excellent. I know I've been pinged that Justice and Diahann have questions, and Yusuf as well. So let's go Diahann, Justice, and Yusuf, and then we'll wrap up and head into some conversations separately with Tiki and with Nate. So let's go Diahann first, then Justice, then Yusuf. Go ahead, Diahann.
But how can athletes help with what's going on today? Like, how can you?
Okay, so I think the question, Diahann, is how can athletes help? What can they do to help the current situation?
So it's a very good question. I'm sure all you guys have Twitter. There is a account you should look at. His name is Emmanuel Acho. He is an analyst for ESPN. And he put out this morning a conversation with Black, I forget what he titled it, but Conversations with Black Friends or something like that. And he goes through very briefly, it's about a 9-minute clip, but he goes through very briefly why there is so much misunderstanding between African Americans and Caucasians around the rhetoric that we use. So why do Black lives matter and not all lives matter? Things like that. And it's educational. So, and the reason that he can do that is because he had a successful NFL career. He's got a successful broadcasting career now, and he has a platform and he has the resources to do something that will catch our attention. Right? When you think about protest and rioting, the reason that happens is because we're trying to catch somebody's attention. Right? You're trying to get them to pay attention. It's no different than, as Nate will know, and those who have kids, when your young son or daughter is screaming at the top of his lungs, he just wants your attention. And so I think athletes have the ability to capture attention, especially in a world and a society where politicians have become somewhat untrustful. We don't necessarily go to them for our compasses, and athletes tend to be viewed in a positive light. And so when they speak, we listen, and they are able to grab our attention. So I think that's one thing that athletes can do, because the platform is huge. It's bigger than it's ever been.
And that image, and the image you showed captures that too. All three groups are looking at the athletes, you know, so you can have a wide scope of breadth of impact that you can have being an athlete.
All right, I think maybe we can get Justice to go really quickly.
So my question is, how can they keep the message from being stolen by those looking to cause trouble?
That's a good question.
That is a
Well,
very
I'll
good
get a little
question.
bit spiritual. I'll get a little bit spiritual here, but I think one of the root problems with all this is there's an enemy fighting all of us because it doesn't want us to get along. It doesn't want us to have equity. It doesn't want us to work together as brothers and sisters, you know? So to realize the enemy, to recognize the enemy and not pin that on other people is really strong and powerful for us.
Diahann or Tiki, before I take Yusuf's question.
You know, I would just add, I think we put a lot of emphasis on social media and it's important, but one of the things that athletes do that's really important with RISE is we put up multi-week programming inside of communities. And when athletes show up in person, there's something to be said about your message coming directly from you. And we find that that has, when our young people in Detroit and Charlotte and Chicago have been spending time with these same types of lessons with athletes involved and often with law enforcement, your message fully belongs to you as an individual. And there's a chance to ask questions and people to understand your thought fully as opposed to others kind of adding on your intentions. So I think one of the things we keep trying to do and we're going to do more of is that in person, because social media does not replace human interaction in that way.
Thank you, Diahann.
I think you're right, Diahann, and I'll add real quickly. Think about the nature of social media. So if you have an Instagram account or a Twitter account, you might see something profound. Almost immediately, it's gone, right? It goes. It's replaced by something else. So to answer your question directly, I think if an athlete is interested in being the messenger, he has to keep sending the message over and over and over again, because it gets replaced and diluted really, really quickly, especially with the mediums that we communicate over now.
Yusuf?
Good morning. I wanted to ask how power or a lack of power affects individuals, and just like reflecting on a time where you felt like you were in power or you weren't in power, how that may have mobilized you, empowered you, or hindered you.
Thank you.
It's a good question. As I think about power, I think power is one of those things that is probably part of the problem, and especially if it feels absolute. I think back to the George Floyd situation. Clearly, the officer who was arrested felt like he had power, and those around him, his peers, felt like they were powerless to stop him. And so I think power has it has a not to reuse the word, but a powerful effect on everyone, not just the individual, but those around the individual. I'm trying to think if I think it also it's determined by how you're raised and what your values are and knowing right and wrong. And I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. We talk to them all the time about what's right and what's wrong. And it sounds simple, but sometimes the basics aren't addressed enough. And the more you can address the basics of right and wrong, I think the more power becomes benevolent and it becomes helpful as opposed to derogatory.